Okay, and actually, yes, I'm interested in curriculum policy and the studies since my master's degree, and actually now I'm actually participate actively in revision of the new basic educational curriculum standards. So actually this a working opportunity always also provide me the opportunity to know more about policy making and policy implementation. So today I will share my screen, right? No, I couldn't share my screen, right?
Oh, I'm asking Jill to make you as co-host. Just
I'm gonna. You should.
I couldn't. Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't have that.
Should be able
Oh,
now, Professor.
okay now. I think it's okay now. Yes?
Oh yes, we saw it.
Right, yeah. Today actually, yeah, I would like to share with you about a recent curriculum reform in China, in mainland China. And actually today's talk, Tom, is a little bit from last time, actually, because I lost my PPT of last time. So I rewrote this PPT, and actually it may change some of the content. Actually, today I will divide my sharing into three parts. The first part is that I will spend several minutes to introduce the trend of China's core competencies-oriented curriculum reform in the context of the global trend. And in order to clarify that curriculum policy making is especially cultural and context sensitive, that bears the hallmarks of the particular country's tradition and cultures, rather than merely following the global format or pressure. The second and the third parts will elaborate in detail about how China's recent curriculum reform takes a unique look from the special relationship among policy research and practice and the historical perspective. So I will start. Actually, I think maybe you are familiar that especially in the 21st century, after the 2010, that the key competencies or core competencies or transformative competencies, whatever it is called, this approach of curriculum and learning change started to become the new logo or flag of the world in transformation, educational and curriculum reforms. Many international organizations and national governments are trying to build a different framework to support the 21st century learners in their economic life, to become better social citizens, and to to enjoy their life better. So many international organizations have developed their own framework for the 21st century core competencies, such as the DESICO, the OECD's Education 2030's transformative competencies, the rainbow bridge of the partnership of the 21st century, its famous 4C, and the ATC 21st century's 10 competencies. And also Michael Fullan in his book also identified 6C important competencies in the deep learning age. And based on this important framework from the international organizations, that many countries are learning from those experiences of international organizations and also other countries. And they also researched and developed their own national core competencies framework. That's also the same picture of China's recent curriculum reform that in 2012, that the Ministry of Education put forward the requirements of the comprehensively implementing quality-oriented education and deepening the comprehensive reform in the field of education. And it is clearly stated in the document that the fundamental task of education should be cultivate people with moral integrity and cultivate social builders. And after the 2012 document, the Ministry of Education issued a document, the opinions on comprehensively deepening the curriculum reform and implementing the fundamental task of promoting moral education. And in this document, it is proposed that later on, China's curriculum reform will be based on a new framework, which is called the core competencies-oriented framework. So since then, that the Chinese government and the academic field has started to trying to build and develop a new framework for the as the picture for the future educational and curriculum reform. So in 2013, the Ministry of Education has started the revision of the high school curriculum standards. And this task, the revision of the curriculum standards for senior high school, is considered as the key field and an important link in promoting the comprehensively deepening curriculum reform and implementing the fundamental task of fostering moral education. So it focused on, firstly, develop the discipline-oriented core competency framework and reform the students' achievement quality standards. And secondly, the revision of the curriculum standards for senior high schools is trying to solve the problems that is presented in the nearly more than 10 years senior high school curriculum reform, because the last senior high curriculum reform started from 2003. And thirdly, the basic task of this revision work is to align with the college entrance examination reform policy to try to change the traditional approach from educate for scores and education for examination approach, and try to cultivate more holistic students and learners for future society. So in 2016, September, the release of the formal framework for the development of core competencies for Chinese students marked the new stage of competence-oriented curriculum reform in China's educational system, identifying the 3 clusters, important competencies, and 6 sub-elements in the whole framework, and 18 indicators, namely the cultural foundation, social participation, and autonomous development. And this framework actually has set the fundamental theoretical framework for not only the senior high schools, but also basic education's core competence-oriented curriculum reform. So in the after the 2013 revision of the senior high school curriculum standards, and in 2017, they released the senior high school's new curriculum standards. And actually in 2020, there is a new revision of the 2013 senior high school's curriculum standards. And then in 2019, the Ministry of Education launched the revision of the curriculum standards for the compulsory education from the year 1 to the 12 basic education, and trying to cultivate the 3 halves in the new era. The 3 halves means having lofty aspirations, having superb abilities, and having responsibility and confidence to take on the task of the national rejuvenation. In particular, cultivating students' patriotism, sense of social responsibility, innovative spirit, and practical ability has become the most important tasks of basic education. So actually, China's core competencies-oriented curriculum reform is developed in the background of the international core competencies-oriented reform trend. And it is absorbing the reasonable continuation and theoretical basis from the international research on the key competencies. But it is more than learning from the international experiences, but it is more a rethinking of whom to educate and how to educate based on the current China's political, economic, and social development problems and trends in China. Different from the international narratives that there are some very obvious features of China's core competencies-oriented curriculum reform. The first is that it is focused on the wholeness of learners' development. Unlike other international organizations' framework that, for example, key competencies can be equaled to 4 C's, right? Critical thinking, cooperative ability, etc., or 6 C's, or it can be like divided into like a list of competencies. But in China's core competencies discourses, that we think that core competencies is not a simple listing and a superimposing of the skills or the fragment elements of competencies. But key competencies are the essential competencies and the character of the people, which is the holistic quality of the learner's development. It is composed of several competencies, but it is not equal to the listed competencies. But we focus more on the wholeness of the learner's development. Core competencies in our sense is not only about what we know and understand, but what we can do, as well as the values and the attitudes and the belief system we behold during the process we are doing things. So this is a much more integrated way of understanding key competencies. And secondly, that we place a lot of emphasis on innovation and creation abilities in particular, because unlike the traditional approach in educating people to get a better job or get a better further education, this new core competence-oriented reform try to invite students to focus more on the realities and the real life problem solving, try to stimulate the innovation and creativity at the different level of the society, and to solve the practical problems in China's social development, and to solve our own problems and find our own roots. So this pursuit is very prominent in the recent curriculum reform. And the third feature is that we emphasize and focused on cultivating people's virtue, especially to re-emphasizing on the China's traditional virtue in the culture of the self-cultivation, self-perfection, and the social responsibilities, and try to build up the social, the cultural and the national pride and confidence is another important task in promoting the core competencies-oriented curriculum reform. So this is the basic picture that China's core competencies-oriented curriculum reform, that's even though it is developed in the global context, but it is has its particularity according to the cultural specialization and the problems that in China's current educational system. So as Kogan has reminded us that the national history, memory, and educational policy should not to be integrated into the grand narrative of generalized meta history, as curriculum policy is also the same issue. It is also the most typical policy with the specific context, tradition, and cultural imprint of the country, which needs to be firmly rooted in the historical experience and problems of each country. So in this sector, I would like to focus on that how that the tradition in China's curriculum reform practice, in China's curriculum policy making and curriculum theoretical research that matters and influence this core competencies-oriented curriculum reform. That's how the tradition that influences the promotion of the new curriculum reform and where it is come from and how it becomes the current representations. The first features from the tradition is that China's curriculum research and the curriculum policy making is always practice oriented. Different from the Western curriculum research, which pays much more attention to the theoretical construction. China's actually curriculum research, even the theoretical research and the curriculum policy making has very obvious features and attributions of action and practice orientation. To some extent, it is influenced by the pragmatism, Confucianism tradition that solving the practical problem is the important driving forces in China's curriculum reform and also in China's curriculum theoretical development. So the core competencies-oriented curriculum reform, it is not only about developing the theoretical framework for the Chinese students' core competencies structure and framework, but it is also considering the urgent needs and the priority of the educational reform. And we are trying to put up a new flag in the educational system in trying to transforming the educational traditional thinking in the new era. The second is that this new core competencies-oriented curriculum reform is trying to facing the traditional curriculum culture and habits, which are constraining the educational system from transforming the traditional system. Because in China, two of the traditional cultural habitats or custom has become the very constraints of educational reform. The first is that the examination and the selection tradition that emphasize the knowledge base and academic performance of the students, especially represented by the high risk, high competitive and selective college entrance examination system. And from the very early year, especially maybe from the school year like 8 or 9, which is junior school, right? Junior middle school, the year 8 and 9, that students are putting more efforts on trying to preparing for the examinations. So this has become a very vicious ecosystem for the education, that people are paying more attention and spend more time on preparing for the academic examination rather than spend time on real learning and deep learning. And second, cultural tradition and habitat is that the social cognitive schema and pressure from the public opinion that many of the parents and from the social politics, that they think that education system is trying to help the students to get better jobs and to get a better lives, and it has only has the utilitarian and the instrumental role in our life. So this also has become the very constraint of the educational reform. So it is not only the issue of the educational field, but also becomes the issue of the transformation of the whole educational, of the whole social system and culture. So core competence-oriented curriculum reform is also the response to the traditional constraints of the educational system. And thirdly, that in China's curriculum reform, that curriculum, the government who are promoting curriculum policies is always playing the indispensable role in promoting the development, not only the curriculum reform practice, but also has become a very important force in promoting curriculum theoretical development and curriculum research. China's curriculum research is booming after the 1980s. If you are reading the supplementary reading I supplied, then you may have a basic picture that only after the reforming and the opening up of China, that because we are going to restore the Chinese curriculum and the teaching system during that time. So that practical needs of curriculum and instruction development has promoted the development in curriculum studies in China. And since then, the scholars in curriculum studies has becoming more, and we have developed the branches to cultivate young learners and young scholars in universities. And especially after the 1993 curriculum reform, that the Ministry of Education launched the nationwide survey on the implementation of the 1993 curriculum reform, and try to initiate a new, which we call the 8th new curriculum reform in China. After the new curriculum reform, that China's curriculum research has become even more developed and fostered after them. So actually, government and educational policy making has becoming the very driving forces in promoting China's curriculum research and the academic area. So in this sense, that China's core competencies-oriented curriculum reform is not the result of single forces. It is not only the call from the practice pursuit, not only the power from the national government, not only the academic research discovers in the curriculum theoretical research area, but it is a result of the integration of the various forces. That's especially in China, I think this is the very prominent phenomenon in the curriculum studies, that the three forces in the curriculum research, the field, and the curriculum, the political forces and the practice forces are greatly and deeply integrated and intertwined with each other. And thirdly, that the third part is that I would like to emphasize that China's core competence-oriented curriculum reform is not the following the international trend thing, but it is or not only the product of the time, but it is also the expansion and the deepening of the curriculum reform in China's history, curriculum reform history. If we look at the curriculum reform in historical perspective and considering curriculum reform as a continuous journey rather than on-spot event. So this is very important to understand deeply about China's current curriculum reform. So if you have a little knowledge or a picture of China's curriculum reform, then you may have this this guideline to have a brief picture of how the curriculum reform in China has developed since the 1950s. In each different stage that we may have different emphasis and rationale in promoting the curriculum reform. From the two basic approach to the three-dimensional curriculum goals approach. And nowadays, especially after 2010, and we now focus on the core competencies-oriented curriculum reform. Two basics is focused on the basic knowledge and the basic skills, which sets the basic tune for China's curriculum culture and the curriculum background, that we focus on knowledge and skills and the base focused on the memorizing and the cramming education, didactic approach of teaching in our traditional curriculum system. And this is also, along with development of the curriculum system, we try to change the situation. So in the 1996 new curriculum reform, we bring up the new three-dimensional curriculum goals, which means that we are not only to cultivate and to let students learn the knowledge and skills, but also the process and the method, as well as to integrate emotion, attitudes, and values into our learning goals. But since then, that we since the 2012, that we, after the more than 10 years implementation of the 8th new curriculum reform, we find out that sometimes this three-dimensional curriculum goals could be separated in the real implementation of the curriculum. The teachers will, in one unit, they will focus on the knowledge and skills, and on another unit, they will focus on the process and the method, and maybe on another unit, they will focus on the values and the attitudes. And they considering these goals as could be implemented separately. So this is very problematic, which is different from the very rationale of the curriculum reform. So we put up the new core key competencies oriented curriculum and try to solve these problems. So this core competence-oriented education, at least in three perspectives, that it try to deepening and expand the traditional curriculum reform in China. Firstly, is unlike the quality education concept that we raised up in the 1980s, which is against the examination-oriented education. The core competencies-oriented concept is more focused on the comprehensive quality that can be acquired through education, not is the innate quality of the students. It is not the inherited quality of the students from his parents and families, but it is highlighting the value of education. In the hope that the new flag will also bring the transformation of the educational thinking, especially the views of children and the views of academic achievement standards and the view of education. The second deepening of the traditional curriculum reform is that the proposal of the core competence-oriented education hopes to break the internal separation of the three-dimensional goals proposed by the 8th curriculum reform, and emphasize that the core competencies are much more comprehensive quality of the learners. It could not be divided into pieces, but the real key competencies, the core competencies of the learner or the character of the learner is not to be decomposed. So this is the another highlights. And finally, the deepening of the former curriculum reform is that the core competence-oriented curriculum reform actually further and trying to further the problems that to be solved by the 8th curriculum reform. In the 8th new curriculum reform that initiated in 2001, there are 4 fundamental transformations in the 8th new curriculum reform in China. The first is from the elitist education to the education for all. From the subject-centered curriculum to social constructed curriculum. The transformation of pedagogic approach. And fourthly is from the centralized curriculum control to the curriculum decentralization. And we promote a national, local, and school level curriculum in the last curriculum reform. And many of the problems has already been solved. But the core competencies oriented curriculum reform actually further the problems we are going to solve. It also bring up new problems that we are going to solve in the new era of the curriculum system. The first is that from education for all to fair and quality education for all. And secondly is that from utilitarianism and instrumentalism approach to the wholeness development of the people. And thirdly is that from the subject matter knowledge as content standard to go beyond the subject knowledge and emphasize on helping students to understand the essential ideas and mode of thinking and practical skills of the subject matter and across the subject matter, and to bring the learning into the real life problem solving to help the students develop with their transferable and creative competencies. And lastly is that try to transform the examination-oriented evaluation system to the evaluation, to how the evaluation could support students' sustainable learning and development. So you could see, we could see recently in order to help with promoting and the implementation of the new curriculum reform that the national government has put up and released a series of documents and reform policies relating with the evaluation system and the college entrance examination system. So this is actually the government and the educational field is really trying to change the examination-oriented approach in our educational system. So this has become the deepening of the curriculum reform than the former ACE new curriculum reform. So in this sense, actually, this new core competencies-oriented curriculum reform is not from nowhere. It's not from the sky and from the international trend, but it is a historical continuous thinking of the educational system itself. Lastly, I would like to emphasize is that China's core competencies-oriented curriculum reform has its own connotations and has its own highlights. It is developed in the background of the global trends, but it is also deeply rooted in our culturally and historical curriculum field. Even though nowadays that the international community and organizations are playing more and more influence on the emergent global education policy formation and influencing the national policy making. This is the reality. But however, when it relates to the development and implementation of the real curriculum policy, it is always right to take the places and the people into consideration. Only by returning to the national, local, and subnational architecture and apparatus could we better understand the issue deeply and meaningfully, and understand the particular features and attributions of this reform, rather than understand it's superficially only about its phenomenon. Yeah, we need to go beyond the representations and to understand what it is really means and how it is making sense to the people in particular places and particular growing background. So that's all for my sharing, and I hope I controlled time. Yeah. Thank you for your patience and attention.